Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar this morning on developing integrated public transport systems to compete with the car, one of the Land Link series that Sistra are supporting. I'm Catherine Jones. I'm a project director at Sistra, and I'll be introducing you to a great range of panelists today who will be taking you through some presentations, and then we'll be opening up the floor to a panel discussion and taking questions from all of the participants. So we're looking forward to a really good discussion this morning. We first of all got Jenny Raggett, the Director for Transport for New Homes, who'll be followed by Dominic Wally. Then we'll have a presentation from Torsten Don, who will be joined by Katja Stills at the end. And finally, David Milner will provide the final presentation before our panel discussion.
So do I go on?
Just before we get going, Landor are presenting a conference in London on the 8th of November, which will carry on the discussion that we're starting today about transport and housing. And there's a 25% discount for all webinar attendees if you use the code on the screen, and that will be provided also with the links that come out later. Right, so let's get on to the presentations. I'd like to introduce Jenny Raggett, Director for Transport for New Homes, who will be telling you about her trip to Europe to look at housing and transport there. Thanks very much, Jenny.
Right. Hi there. Yeah, I'm Jenny Raggett. We're Transport for New Homes, and we specialise in doing field trips to places to see what's actually on the ground in terms of sustainable transport. And we visited the Netherlands, Sweden and Germany to have a look. But we'll start with the Netherlands and then go on to Sweden. So basically, next slide, I can go on. Next slide. So housing in the Netherlands. It turns out that the Netherlands, just like us, need a lot of new homes. And so they've got a target, and I've provided a link in this slide when they're up, if you want to read more about how they intend to get to that target. But the most important thing is that they are taking a very measured land use approach to where they build and how much they build. Next slide. So they don't use, unlike us, an algorithm to dissipate the need for new homes right across the country to different urban areas. As I say, there is a national strategy instead, and that strategy takes into account everything, including agriculture, nature, environment, economy, and very importantly, public transport connections. So public transport is seen absolutely key from the word go at national level. Next slide. So those who are interested, there is a public transport in 2040 vision. And this is the government vision, and it's quite surprising because a lot of it is about connectivity by local rail. And we experience this brilliant local rail, 15-minute frequencies. You just turn up at the station. Next slide. So this vision that the government has is actually matched by real investment, and it's firm investment in light rail, local rail, and improvements to rail system in general, in order to support very specific areas of large-scale housing growth. And that's just part of a list. If you want to read more, I've got a link to the International Railway Journal 2022, which gives it. Next one. There we are. So it's not just rail. The idea is that the railway stations kind of focus, and that you have trams, buses, and of course cycling and walking. And this photo just shows a sort of combination, I guess, of a really good bus system and the cycling and walking framework. I think this is from Almere. Next slide. So we were really interested in the contrasting urban forms that were being built in new areas of the Netherlands. Houten, sorry, which we visited, which was all about cycling, and there are 2 new stations. How different from many urban extensions that we've seen in this country. And the Dutch specifically said, we do not want the strategic road network slowed down by local traffic emanating from new housing. Next slide. So here's a big difference. In England, we're used to a lot of master planning by developers, but of course in Holland we get the municipal planners doing zoning plans, and you can have a look at these online, which detail in great detail everything, including the sustainable transport network. So they will locate a new housing development right abutting an existing urban area if they can, and then the sustainable transport corridors, the buses, everything follows through and meshes in with the existing urban area, and that's really important. Next slide. If you're interested, you can go online and actually see an interactive map of how the expansion of a new housing area is taking place, because the municipality provides maps to show the different projects going on at the moment. And these projects encompass everything. It's not just homes, it's the whole works, including community facilities being built. Next slide. So on to Sweden. I mean, in many respects, we just visited 2 places in Sweden, Växjö, which is sort of down to the south, and Uppsala, which is north of Stockholm. And I mean, it is the similar concept of having a national view, a regional view of where to build. And then the municipalities have a lot of power as to location and vision. And in both those places, Växjö and Uppsala, the vision is reduction in cars and sustainable transport as key. Next slide. So, you know, if you want to read about the incredible vision for Uppsala, which is to expand by tens of thousands of people, I do recommend this. What will Uppsala be in 2050? And they will carry through that vision, which is the interesting thing. Next slide. So just if you're interested, we take a lot of photographs. So this is Rosendal, which is a new area of Uppsala. And this is just taken from the excellent buses. And what is striking is how many people are using buses, how many people are walking and cycling. And all of these things are really just taken for granted, and you can get anywhere. Next slide. You can even travel, which we were very pleased about, because to the lakes and the forests by bus. There are regular services, I mean, every 15 minutes, right out to favourite walking areas, because the Swedes believe that even if you are living in an urban area, you shouldn't necessarily have to have a car to go out. Next slide. One of the themes in Sweden is, I think they call it proximity. Here we would probably call it density. So this is an aerial view of the kind of thing they're building, mostly 6 stories high, but note every block like this has a green area, and each green area is different. And the whole idea is that by having a proximity of population, you will support not just bus services, but local shops, local amenities, and everything else. Next slide. So this is a sort of better view, really, of one of the green areas in Kungsangen, where we had a look. There's a lot of cycle parking because, of course, cycling is popular. And in winter, the cycle parking moves into the basement, but people are still on their bikes, apparently. There were loads of local shops already open in a comparatively new area. Even a dentist, we noticed, which is a surprise. Right, next slide. Yeah, this is the businesses are not just sort of your clone towns, as I would call them. There's also local independent businesses like this cafe and bookshop, and that was in at street level with the flats above. Next one. Vecchio, I think it's pronounced, I'm not sure, is similar. It's an urban extension on green fields, but you can see there's the same theme, which is high density, all around walking, cycling with really good buses. I would say the buses in Vecchio were just excellent, easy to use, modern and cheap. But this is a deliberate way of building to enable sustainable transport. Okay, next one. I included this just because it was amusing at the supermarket that all the children and local teenagers would come by bike, and everybody was carrying a bike helmet around the supermarket. But we thought that was very indicative of how active travel is really widely used. Next slide. Yeah, this is Vecchio Station. I took this really because I thought it was very impressive that when you arrived by train, you just moved across the platform, and lo and behold, there were buses very clearly marked with real-time information, and you went straight to your destination. So this integration of bus and rail was also fundamental to the success of Vecchio as getting near car-free, not entirely car-free, but moving in that direction. Next slide. Trading estates also had ample cycle paths. I just thought that was amazing, and we saw people cycling. Next slide. So in summary, I mean, this is just from our experience visiting and speaking to some planners and residents. The main theme is careful consideration of land use and environment. And I mean, for example, they avoid a lot of the conflicts we have with biodiversity and water and so on by a very measured approach from the start. National funding for the more expensive public transport schemes. The control that local planners have in specifying and master planning areas. The location of where people build is really important. Brownfield sites or a site closely abutting the urban area. And I suppose there's a buy-in by the people, an expectation of walkable communities and the densification that enables that. The funding of a lot of this is through land value uplift, but that is a whole area in itself, but really important, especially in the Netherlands. And lastly, and ultimately, traffic reduction is seen as not just part of placemaking, but a really important part of our low carbon future. There we are. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jenny. That was really interesting. I'm sure we'll get onto some discussions about the differences between Europe and the UK later. I noticed there's some questions coming in. I forgot to mention earlier, please put your questions in the Q&A, not in the chat. Use the chat if you want to for discussions among yourselves, but please put questions in the Q&A because that's where we'll be looking for them. Thank you very much, Jenny.
Okay.
Right. Our next presenter is Dominic Wally, who's the founder and director of Connect Economics. Dominic, can I ask you to come onto screen?
Hi there.
Hi.
Hi there. Let me just share my window. There we go. I think we should be in business there. So thank you, Catherine, and hello, everyone. I'm Dominic Wally from Connected Economics. I set up Connected Economics nearly 13 years ago now to focus on the links between transport and economic outcomes, and I have a background in modelling and appraisal. And I guess, frankly, I was disaffected with people running transport models and running our transport user benefit analysis program, TUBA, and later WITA and things like this, and saying, well, the project benefit cost ratios, whatever it would be, to lots of decimal places, without really understanding who was affected and why. And so over the last 5 years or so particularly, I've been working a lot with Sistra on these issues, and they've invited me here today to discuss links to economic growth, focusing particularly on a recent project that we did together, exploring rail connectivity and growth in the medium-sized cities of the Midlands. You can see Coventry, Leicester, and Nottingham on the background aerial photo there. So on the one hand, I have the sort of complex and often arcane sweep of transport, productivity, growth, and development to cover. And on the other hand, quite a niche application of some of that thinking in the Midlands. So let's see how we go. Well, there we go. So the new government stated mission is growth. I guess partly because this drives tax and therefore the ability to do a lot of other things, and we're focusing on growth today. But I wanted to make sure that we put our ideas of transport and economic growth in their proper context. I think we tend to think about local growth as local physical development, and that's obviously part of it. But a lot of what transport is doing for businesses is simply enabling to work more efficiently, to do the same in less time. And I guess that immediately points out that central connection between good transport that helps a lot of people to get where they want to go and the economic growth that it brings. And transport also, of course, supports non-traded activities, leisure activities, and that's supporting quality of life without needing to get into all this messy growth-related stuff that's at the bottom of the diagram here. So we value lots of things, and we need to remember that the way that we measure growth through GDP or GVA is just one partial and sometimes not very good measure of that. But when transport changes affect non-transport behaviour, like deciding to visit the town centre more often or commute to a different job perhaps, then other things start to happen in our sort of air quotes real economy. And some of those transport benefits get traded for other non-transport ways of doing things. So transport benefits are one lens that we can look at what transport delivers, and exploring some of these downstream impacts is another lens. We need to be careful there about double counting. And there are also some wider impacts as those changes in behaviour cascade through, and these are often part of the conversation about transport and economic growth, like agglomeration economies, like induced physical development and incentives for developers, and like shifts in the labour market, for example. And clearly, transport investment in itself doesn't sort of magically bring about, for example, new commercial properties. Developers still have to pay for it, but they may be able to capture some of those user benefits, make an otherwise marginal development a successful one, or gain from some of these processes like agglomeration, amplify that value that they can capture. So I think with transport growth in its proper place, let's turn to what we know about these routes to growth, particularly in the context of rail connections in the Midlands towns. So one way transport changes things is by bringing people and businesses closer together. Connectivity supports larger markets, supports economies of scale. Jenny was talking about density before. When this happens at a level bigger than an individual firm, a sector or a city level, we call it agglomeration. And the evidence suggests that a good way to think about this is through the row headings in the table here. Sharing, you think about businesses and people in a city sharing a major indivisible asset like an airport. When you bring them together, matching, you think matching a person with a specific set of skills with an employer that needs those skills, or matching a business customer with a suitable local supplier. And learning, you think of as something like bumping into someone, finding out the local industry gossip when you've got those good connections between people. And it can occur through different markets, such as the labour market or the market for goods and services, the column headings we've got in the table. So we have this sort of richer picture now for thinking about how and where some of these clustering and agglomeration impacts might be strongest by process and by market. And I guess the first thing to say is that the evidence for agglomeration is pretty widespread. It's consistently found across the world and replicated by the Department for Transport in all of the stuff that underpins our transport appraisal. But that evidence is also really noisy and partial, particularly when you start drilling down. So we certainly don't have a comprehensive understanding of which of these boxes are most important and where. But the evidence does provide some very strong hints. And in our work in the Midlands, it really pointed to the three highlighted areas in the table there as being the most important. So first, labour market matching is clearly really important for the success of medium-sized towns, and expanding those labour market catchments. And evidence from the Spatial Economics Research Centre at LSE, for example, and from KPMG, also shows that rail plays a disproportionate role in that and in driving the business behaviour in small towns through expanding those catchments. Second, I'd say access to customers and suppliers is clearly really important. That's the products and services matching box you can see there. When you ask them, companies consistently say that transport access to customers and suppliers is critical. And rail really helps here, particularly for service sector businesses and in those medium-sized towns, particularly for access to London. And finally, third, I suppose there's a lot of slightly more circumstantial evidence that this learning mechanism is also really important, particularly for knowledge economy businesses. Certainly, sectors like architecture, engineering, management, consultancy, etc., seem to benefit an awful lot from these wider catchments and accessibility to other businesses and to labour. So what else can we say about these medium-sized cities that we were studying? Well, agglomeration impacts seem to be pretty similar at all scales of density, whether you're rural and getting a bit better connected or dense and urban and getting a bit better connected. So there doesn't seem to be much specific there. When you look at commuting patterns, though, we can see the role that rail plays, particularly in these medium-sized cities, in extending labour markets out considerably. So again, we've got that labour market matching story. So although the statistics can start to get a bit shaky, the evidence can certainly tell us something useful, and knowing this, I think, helps us to plan a bit better and get the most out of our transport investments. Next, I want to talk a little bit about transport and physical development, influencing people, what people do and where they do it. So there's two photographs up on the screen there. What's the difference between them? Well, I mean, bluntly, one of them had a railway built there 125 years ago. On the left, we've got Nairobi, and on the right is another part of Kenya, a few hundred kilometers distant. And the one on the right's obviously remained empty. I think this is just an amazing story to think about. In 1900, the population of Nairobi was just workers building a railway in a somewhat arbitrary location. And now there's 5.5 million people there, and it's the largest city in the country. So from this more or less arbitrary geographic starting point, the area around that rail yard is the most populous city in Kenya. So in a sense, the story of Nairobi really is the story of the railway. So I just want to kind of put that out there to show how transport could be such a powerful force in shaping our activities. But let's perhaps bring that down to earth a bit more in the UK and think about how that works here and now. When they move, again, businesses consistently say transport's the most important factor in governing where they move to. And around 3.5% of businesses move every year, as well as new businesses being formed, and that there's other reasons for churn. Smaller businesses, ones in support services and professional services, tend to be much more footloose and move much more often. And when we looked at Nottingham, Leicester and Coventry, between 100 and 200 businesses will typically move into each of those places each year from other areas. So there's scope for reshaping our cities through investments in public transport. We also know that the sustained reductions we've seen in the costs of car travel have driven most of urban sprawl, and there's been some really good work on that from quite careful studies, particularly in the USA, but also elsewhere. What I think is interesting is, on the rail side, we know surprisingly little from an economic statistical kind of point of view for studying this. We know that it tends to concentrate activity at hubs rather than having this dispersing effect that roads have. But most of the international evidence is actually from freight-dominated places like the USA and China. It tends to focus on moving goods around. But UK railways are primarily moving people, so that doesn't help us very much. And at a short distance, we know a little from the transit-oriented development work. We know that it tends to increase residential amenity and property prices. There's also some evidence that it tends to be attractive for startups moving to areas around commuting stations, especially in knowledge sectors. But these effects tend to be very local, reaching around a quarter of a mile. So again, that specific evidence is partial. We have to kind of read between the lines. So in our recent work, we looked at the three cities. Coventry was specialized in motor trades and advanced manufacturing. Development plans there are really based around campuses and business park style developments. And most of the recent growth there has been in transport and related businesses. Leicester's an interesting case. It's historically a textile town. There's a legacy of small and kind of fragmented commercial plots with little office space. And Nottingham's very heavily service sector dependent. So these three cities are really very different, been growing in quite different ways with different plans for their future growth. I'm just looking at the time. Where does all this leave us? I guess transport is clearly one part of a toolkit that can help us to address some of these economic problems, and some of the things that we know that it's done in the past and we've seen its effect can help us to think about how to integrate it more effectively into the way that we expect it to drive change and how we capture some of that value. But when we think about transport and other investments, things start to get really muddy. It's very difficult from our ivory towers to try and unpick to what extent it's that transport connectivity that's driving change, to what extent it's urban realm and other things. For example, when we looked at some case studies in Bristol, Temple Meads and Cardiff, there were a lot of other coordinated changes going on. So BBC Wales and HMRC relocated to Central Scare in Cardiff as well. So there's the transport can deliver growth, but really it needs to be aligned with other local needs and supportive of those policies. And we found that in some cases, perhaps that fit is not so good. Thank you.
Thanks, Dominic. There's some really interesting puzzles there, I think, in terms of understanding exactly how transport influences growth and how growth is dependent on transport, but other aspects as well. So yeah, much more to think about. Can I introduce now Torsten Don, who's the Head of Department for Urban Planning and Housing in the City of Stuttgart, to give us his thoughts on his experiences from that city and elsewhere. Thank you, Torsten.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Hi, everybody. I hope my microphone works. Yeah, should be. So my background is I'm a town planner, and I used to work at Tibbles in London. So I was asked if I could contribute a few nice examples from southern Germany, but I'll put in some Austrian examples as well. So I'm head of town planning in the city I'm working for, like about 320 people. The city of Stuttgart is the sixth largest city in Germany. Was probably founded around a mare, so a stud, sorry, so a horse farm, and that's where the name comes from. So it means basically mare garden. Just to give you an example how large we are, we're kind of between Bristol and Glasgow if you compare it to UK cities, but we've got a pretty large area conurbation or metropolitan area. So we'd be like between Leeds and Manchester, considering that. So just to give you an idea, so even our underground system ventures out of the city at like 5 or 6 places. Most people, if they're asked about Stuttgart, if they know anything about it, it's mostly like it's Germany's Motown. So it's Mercedes Porsche and Bosch are based here, but there's much more to it. It's got almost as much mineral water as Budapest. It was bombed to shreds, and here at the bottom you see like it's one of the cradle of modernist architecture, like about 100 years ago. Because it's the city center is in a valley basin, we've got like the oldest department of urban climatology in the whole of Europe, or probably worldwide, because we're really being roasted in summer. We've got all our hilly slopes used to be vineyards, so we've got a lot of those open air staircases, and we've got, like I put in for all the transport enthusiasts about you, we've got a rag or cock railway with a mobile bike stand. So let's just dive into it. So Stuttgart is kind of situated halfway between Paris and Vienna. We've got pretty good fast train connections, especially to Paris, more than to Vienna. So we jumped right into it because you've got like a very rough idea where I'm coming from. So we're talking about putting in transport first and what kind of ingredients we use in southwestern Germany and most parts of Germany as well as Austria, and I'll give you a few examples. So we've got the biggest railway project in the whole of Europe, where we'll put, as you can see here, where we put all our railway infrastructure in a like ring system underground, which means we are going to get 3 new neighborhoods, which are all going to be very close to the city center. So we're not doing greenfield development on the edge of town, but right in the city center. And just to give you one example here, it's going to be a very dense mixed-use neighborhood. You can see it's all tracks at the moment. So we're talking about opening that in about 2 years' time. And so the first thing I want to bring to you is like thinking about minimum parking requirements. So we can reduce those. And in this instance, we are really bold in German terms to go down from what usually is 1 parking spot per dwelling to 0.1. So, and another 0.1 for like car sharing systems. So 0.1 private uh, um, um, parking spots. So this is quite revolutionary, especially for a city that became rich on cars, right? But it's because we've got so many good public transport connections. And just to give you an idea, the S means it's like the suburban fast metro system, and U means underground, which is our local light rail system, the yellow one here, which is running underground only in the city center. And we'll put this line not only underground, but we already have the station built here now, which is then going to open in 2 years' time. So it's all going to be there. We've got several other light rail connections around it. You can see it here. So we actually can go down that much. We will also put a bus through here. Maybe it's going to be in a 5, 6, 7 years. It's going to be an automated self-driving bus. We just don't know yet. So as you can see, Todd, if you can, transit-oriented development, as the Americans call it. So that's really important to bring, if you've got the possibility, bring development to transport if you've got it already there. And we do a lot of small scale developments, as you can see here. And again, it's very close to like the suburban express metro and the underground or light rail. So this is really brownfield. We had like, it took us about 8 years to get all the pollution out of the ground. Now let's move on to another city also in the southwest in Germany, Green City Freiburg, quite well known, I think, worldwide, because they were pioneering in terms of eco architecture and very sustainable eco development. And I really like this picture. And please note, it's from 1997. So in the 90s, Freiburg developed one brownfield site and one big grayfield site. It's a university town of about 250,000 people. And because I was asked, well, how do you guys manage to put in public transport before people move in actually they managed to do so. So you can see here in 1996, the first the first section of this new development, Rieselfeld, is just being built. Maybe the first people are moving in, but just a year later, as you can see here, the tram is already on its way, even though people are not living here at all at that point. So this was to encourage people to actually move out there, because out west you can see there's a 1960s development next to it. So this was not a too popular area in the 90s, but it was put on the map. So, and it goes on. So because Freiburg as a university town still has got a big influx of people, so they're just north of what we saw from the 90s is being developed. And the first area, as you can see in the middle, will also have a tram extension there. So they will be having urban rail the moment the first people move in. And just to give you a very bizarre but really, really interesting example, also like what a small town can do, if you've got a billionaire in the background and a lot of funding from elsewhere, is a very small town of like a county head town of 17,000 people, called Künzelsau. They just, as you can see down here, they're sitting in a narrow valley. You can see here it's like the medieval city core, and they wanted to needed to extend, and they just could do it like up the hill. And they started in 1992, like the first people moved in, and by then you had like a huge way to go, like around the hills to by bus. They had a bus route put in, and then they actually came along with this funicular, which is like running all day in a very high frequency, because you don't need as many bus drivers. You just need but one person running the whole thing. So it could replace the bus, and it's very attractive. It's faster. I know that's not going to be a standard solution, but it's possible. And now let's go for big city dwellers to a big city. The second biggest German-speaking city in the world is Vienna, just after Berlin and before Hamburg. And uh, Vienna is doing a lot of urban development. So the one that's currently being developed is Seestadt Aspern, or Lake City Aspern. And as you can see, it's an old airfield, and there's a big motor factory down there. I think it's Ford or Opel, which is like Central European Vauxhall. So you can see there's no buildings, residential buildings here just yet, and they already have the underground put in there, which is raised in this case. And then you can see in 2014 they've got like the first area of residential buildings built up, and it's already running. And you can see from 21 here, I was there last year, so they kind of developing it counterclockwise, and you get a bit of an example of like the density you'll encounter. And the Viennese will do the same just on the southern edge of the city. They just had like their urban competition decided, I think earlier this year, or no, I think it was last year. And again, they'll put a metro or underground in there. So just to think about what are the ingredients. Now I'll talk about a lot of urban design and urban planning, but of course it's like things like frequency, rolling stock. Like, do you have AC in there? Is it nice? Is it modern? Is it comfy? Things like that. Because if it's kind of sexy, then you can target a lot more people to become passengers. It needs to be attractive. It's not only the speed, but it's a lot like frequency, and also like the rolling stock and things like that. So, and what you need is a livable city around it. I'm actually sitting in the building above the cafe here. This was like a very busy street just 4 years ago, and was turned into a bicycle street, which has car access, but it's mostly used by bikes. And cafes are popping up, a lot of like outside seating, etc. And so I was talking about the rolling stock. Of course, it's reliability. So in Germany, the national race got a big problem because we kind of thought we should copy all the mistakes Britain did in the 80s and 90s and copy them and do them 10 years later. So we've got a lot of underinvestment in national rail, but the local transit or transport is usually quite good. And of course, since we've got a big shortage of drivers, those little pods which are being experimented with at the moment will also be like a big topic, I think, in the 2030s. And of course, one thing we're quite superior to the Dutch and the Swedes is like our national local transport ticket. So it's 49 euros at the moment, and it's going to be 58 pretty soon, but which will get you on any public transport nationwide around the country. So anything that's not high-speed trains, you can take. So just conclusion from what we do and how we do it is just focusing on the most important thing. Yes, we as in the Netherlands, it should be led by the public sector. Of course, it can be like some sort of PPP, but it should be the public sector that leads. We need livable public realm around it. We can reduce parking requirements, and that's where where it gets more attractive for developers. Because as we tend to put all our parking underground to have less on-street and backyard parking, this of course saves a lot of money. If you and you can reduce the road width if you've got less cars. So, and like install bus priority, have bus lanes. If you have any light railway anywhere near within 20 miles, make sure your bus lanes will be able to be retrofitted in like 30 years to become like a light railway access. And it should be really there before the first person moves in. So, and if light rail is nothing for you because you can't fund it, or it's just simply not there, make sure it's a reasonable bus system. And if you've got public transport nodes and you can move development towards it, I mean, it's going to be quite interesting how Britain will do it with all the brownfield sites in the green belts, where you sometimes have railway lines crisscrossing them. So there may be opportunities, and if you can't move to public transport, then public transport has to move to your development. Of course, we heard about mixed use with local amenities, so people won't have to hop into a car. But really, it's if you don't have a decent public transport in the first place, people will buy cars, well, they will get used to cars, and will take you generations to get them back. So and that's not only the case, I think, probably in Britain or in Germany, but that's what, like, I just listened to the Urbanist Agenda, a Canadian podcast this morning. So and we also know all the strong town stuff coming over from the States, which have much more problems than we do because they've got much more sprawl. So induce demand for public transport before you induce demand for for cars. I'm sitting there
Well,
where the
thank you
red
very
spot
much,
is. We're done. Thank you.
Going to ask you to wrap up there, yes, just so we can keep
I'm done.
the webinar going. Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I don't know whether you want to introduce Katja at this point.
Yes, sorry, I will just jump in here briefly. I'm only going to join the Q&A. I'm Katja Stiller, Director at Tibbles, and we really, as an urban designer, work across the UK from strategic planning, local plan allocations through to delivery, as well as kind of having a good understanding of the German system, although not as detailed and as up-to-date as Torsten. So look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. And can I finally introduce David Milner, who's the Director for Create Streets, to give us the final presentation. David.
Thank you very much. Hopefully, My video's apparently been stopped, so no one can see me. So I think maybe the host needs to allow that. There we go. Hopefully that makes it a bit better. Apologies, my internet just went down, so I've dashed to local cafe. So hopefully my headphones are doing the job, and you're not going to get too much background noise. It's awesome. That was brilliant. Thank you. My brother lives in Ludwigsburg, so I was dead keen to hear about the update on the big kind of Stuttgart housing plans, and at Cray Streets, we're sort of very big fans of light rail and tram. I've just done a report on how we can get that going in the UK, which is really missing a trick, I think, on delivering light rail and housing around that. So I've got 10 minutes, I believe, to take you through the case study we did for Chippenham, based on report stepping off the road to nowhere. So I'll rush through a few of these slides, and if you've got any questions, you're happy to do that and take those. So what do we do? Following a report on traffic modelling called Computer Says Road, we basically wanted to use this on a real example. There's no point sort of sometimes doing some theoretical papers and then not showing how will this deliver more homes on less land with better transport and better outcomes on a real site. And it was all looking at the predict and provide and transfer to vision-led transport modelling, which a few of the people might have heard or seen in the draft at MPPF. So I'll quickly introduce that and then show you what we did. I think a lot of people know that we've got deep-rooted problem in the UK with development. A lot of stuff we've just seen from Thorsten is like chalk and cheese to most of the developments that we see across the UK. We know that we need to deliver a huge number of homes to tackle our housing crisis, and we know that we've got it's very difficult to do that in terms of unlocking sites. And if we carry on the way we are, it's going to be bad for the environment. Frankly, it's bad for the economy and agglomeration effects, and it's bad for the towns and cities that we love. Some of the negatives, if we carry on the current way, it's really expensive. Billions and billions and billions going in subsidizing some of the big roads. It's very land hungry. It's not good with inequality. We're just going to get more and more congestion, sever communities, and frankly, we just continue creating unpopular places. So the situation where we are with predict and provide is essentially describe existing car travel, forecast for population growth, forecast future car travel. You model it, and then you, with these forecast worst conditions, you essentially develop a proposal for widening this road or this junction. The example that I use is one in Devon, where it was a site where we were trying to introduce a pub, a co-working space, a small shop and a nursery. The developer was going to give everyone an e-bike loan for 3 years, and to do this, we wanted to slightly nudge down parking standards and get the density up a little bit into more to what we call gentle density. And unfortunately, when it came back from transport engineers, they said, no, you can't build 250 homes. You've got to only do 200 on this phase. Therefore, we couldn't support the mixed use. And this was all because the roundabout was going to sort of break. And when it came out, it was essentially the predict and provide modelling that was forcing us to sort of a reduced density, but also forcing the council to have to spend a hell of a lot of money on widening this roundabout. And it didn't give us the freedom to say, hey, look, we're actually trying to develop a place where fewer people have to drive. We're trying to give more options for people to travel by other means, and therefore we can achieve this vision. So we set out to try and challenge this. Predict and provide has not really worked very well. You can see this is a fascinating graph. The black line is reality. All the coloured lines are different predictions from the 80s through to the 90s through to the noughties, showing linear growth on vehicle traffic, and actually the black line is the reality. We're basically just very bad at modelling, and I think we've been getting some of the modelling very accurately wrong to a large number of decimal places for some years, and we keep creating places like this. So to the case study, there was an existing plan. This was the existing one. You can see the sort of teal blob was 7,500 homes over a huge number of acres. Your sort of classic 19 dwellings per hectare, and then a few road options which are sort of badged as a bypass, but you can clearly see it's bypassing right through the middle of new homes. So there's a real segregation isolation effect on this one. There was a £75 million road was the option, and we said if we take a vision validate and start to provide a vision-led approach to this, what could that look like in terms of spending 75 million in a different way? And this is what we went for. So broke this down into a series of big moves. Number one, and I think the most important one, reduce the 350 hectare master plan to 120 hectares. This did not lead us to sort of crazy tower blocks and high dense and sort of tall buildings. This was gentle density, around about 55 dwellings per hectare, terraced homes, some mansion blocks, slightly closer spaces, and not sort of big, sang green space areas within some of the blocks, but actually it allowed the countryside around the blocks to be protected for new residents and existing residents. We located these homes much closer to the train station. There was a huge area to the south, which is really quite far away from the train station, quite far away from the town centre. So we were going with proximity. I really like that phrase, bring the development to public transport. So we tried to do that. We looked at more shops within the sites, and like I just said, it provided easier access to nature for those homes that are already, for those residents already living in. And here's a sort of sketch of the master plan that my team did. Big beliefs in visuals, so we looked at, okay, what would this look like? How do we bring this to life so that local residents aren't sort of alarmed by the word density? And we looked at obviously reflecting some of the local vernacular, updating it for modern building standards, and creating the kind of public spaces that polling and research shows people love and care for. So further big moves to this. So the master plan was one. But part of Vision Led and Vision Validate is about master planners and transport planners working together. And we had some fantastic support from ITP, who were helping us, advising us, and also some really good help from a range of interested individuals who had expertise in transport in the local area as well. So big move two, we put a little bit of money to brownfield lands. There was some capacity for brownfield homes. And we decided we'd put a couple of million, well, 2.5 million of our sort of fictional budget into that, into increasing the viability of brownfield land. Big move three, which is really exciting, was looking at a rail passing loop at Melksham. Now, a different town, it's just to the south of Chippenham, but actually by investing what potentially could be a bit less actually than 15 million, although we are very conservative with the budget, by investing a little bit here could allow you to take the frequency of rail from 6 trains per day to 4 trains per hour. Now, with our planning and transport system, it's very hard at the moment in a lot of areas to actually integrate this and join this thinking up. I think there might be more to come from this project and of how we can sort of try and metrify some of these rail areas. And clearly, by making that move, we can help more people who want to commute by rail from Chippenham to do so, as opposed to having to drive, and therefore we can increase the densities. Big move 4 was looking at improving streets with the new development. That is basically building some roads, but we'd like to say streets. We still needed to build a few streets. We're still providing 7,500 homes. We just needed to do fewer of them, and then move some public transport elsewhere. Therefore, big move 5 was we asked basically what is the gold-plated bus plan for Chippenham. They had one. It was about 1.5 million capex, and it was we put forward about 5 years of revenue until our site would actually get built out and the people would move in and therefore start to kind of sustain this and reduce the subsidy. And so we did that, funded the sort of gold-plated network to help people commute by bus. There was some money to go into car hubs and mobility hubs. And then I think Big Move 7, which is a really exciting one, coming from, I think, some of the work that you've seen in Poundbury and elsewhere, where businesses wanting to open within your development and create that mixed use, create that mixture of offices, shops, retail, services, so they are located in the right place and not sort of taking advantage of through traffic in the early years of development. We put money towards supporting their rates and rents. Big Move 8 was contributing to the town centre itself. This is going to be the growth of Chippenham by 30, 40, 50% of population. This should be a net benefit, and we need to move away from developments being seen as takers and more seen as givers. So this was about putting 10 million towards the high street. Could be shop fronts, could be public realm, could be renovating buildings that need to be brought back into use, but really making this a competition for out-of-town retail. And again, that can also help with modal shift. And we're working with Sustrans on this, and they did an amazing bit of work on travel analysis. So we put towards a fully funded 15 million cycle network that again would benefit the existing benefit our development or benefit the development on within Chippenham, but also the residents that live nearby as well. So again, not just trying to reduce the modal share from new residents, but of the backgrounds car journeys as well. The really exciting bit, as I said, was working with ITP on transport planning. They then, once we developed the vision, did the validate part, and they did the analysis and modelling. And we found from this, compared to the original master plan, 12,000 fewer car trips per day. A mode share, a huge drop on mode share from 72% to 46%. It's still 46%, it's still quite high. We're still talking about Chippenham, Market Town, Southwest. But it's a huge drop nonetheless. 9,300 more people walking and cycling, decrease in background traffic, and therefore leading to thousands of tons fewer carbon emissions and all public transport users. I'm going to wrap up there. My beep has just gone off for my 10 minutes. I think encapsulated in a nice graphic, which is always helpful these days if you can meme things. Vision validate or vision led or decided providers on the left. This is about the organic growth of towns proximate to where they are to help their agglomeration and help with connectivity. Or on the right, we've got a sort of predict and provide, pushing places apart, almost centrifugal, pushing places apart, pushing roads apart, and pushing development apart. And I will pause there and have to say any questions.
Thanks very much, David. That was really insightful. There was a development of huge development on greenfield sites close to where I live, near Lichfield, right next to a railway station. Sorry, a railway line, and they've built a nursery and a school, but not a station. So absolutely everybody in that new greenbelt development will have to drive to get anywhere. And it does annoy me every time I drive past it that was missed. So this new way of planning could make such a difference. Thank you so much to all the speakers. It's been a really interesting set of presentations, and I'd like to open the floor up now to all of the panelists if they'd like to come back onto camera. We've got lots and lots of questions in the chat. We won't have time for them all, so I do apologise to those people whose questions we don't get through. But I'll pick a few, and then if we can potentially have a discussion amongst the panelists on some of the puzzles posed by our listeners. So I think a number of the questions certainly provoked by Jenny's presentation and Thorsten's is how is this funded? So David, you've gone through how your big moves can transform development around Chippenham. But generally, there's a lot of questions in the Q&A about how on earth such big visions can be funded. So I'd like to ask first, perhaps Jenny and Thorsten about their experiences, how this works in Europe.
Hi, it's funny you should mention this because when we were given our tours by the Dutch spatial planners, I asked this question at every moment. So I remember Eindhoven, they were showing me this new wonderful bus train interchange and urban area. How's it funded? Every time we saw some really good local station as part of a new area with shops and so on, who's funded this? Anyway, so they started laughing every time I asked this question. And the answer seems to be that certainly in the Netherlands, for local rail, it's national government. They, and this seems to be going on, they have such a very robust vision of every new development, whether it's an urban extension to an existing town or whether it's a new area, being connected by frequent suburban rail services to the national and European, eventually European rail, that they will put substantial money to it. So that's the railways. When it comes to the buses, the cycleways, so we got, It's the municipality, and what they do is that they land bank in the same way that our developers land bank, but this time, so they've purchased land at very low interest, I believe, and I'm not too sure about this, but there is a special national banking scheme to allow them to borrow money at low interest. They buy areas of land up, and then they are the master planners, the developers, and they make money on the uplift as those areas are developed. That's my understanding, and I think that accounted for a lot. In Sweden, it seemed to be, certainly in Uppsala, not dissimilar, that there was, but most of all, the vision was of building in this particular way of high density around sustainable modes was shared at national, regional and local level, and funding was channeled into that vision. Whereas in this country, I mean, if you take a planning application for a big new so-called housing garden community, I mean, I can't believe how much of the funding is going into the road system. It's extraordinary. So money for transport's used differently, and they're a completely different vision, which David Milner really has highlighted. You know, there are conflicting visions. So,
okay, if I can quickly add that, so it's not too different in Germany from Sweden and the Netherlands. Like our regional transport is organized by the state, so because we're a federal country, and the local transport is mostly done by the county, or if we've got a unitary authority, in my case, the city. We would never even get any permission, or our politician would never agree to the development with big time development without any feasible public transport links. So so this would just not only legally be a problem, but politically, even from the conservative side. I mean, they want public transport, so they've got less cars on the street, so they can drive themselves. Okay, but this is just not a problem. So just yes, part of the funding usually also comes from upzoning, as the Americans would say it. So the difference between the land prices before and after that. And but if, like, the question for me is, how do you fund the streets, and how does the funding work whatever country in the world you're in? And then see, well, can't you divert some of that money to a good public transport infrastructure? So that's kind of my approach if I would talk to anybody anywhere in the world. But that's kind of our background.
You're
Mike-
muted, Catherine.
Sorry. Yeah, I was going to say, David, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, super quick. I mean, I sort of covered most of it. I just, it's all in the land. So there's so much value in the UK, especially because we've got such a hot land market. So, you know, your agricultural land, which is what, £15,000 per acre, you can get 100x or more value uplift in that once you achieve planning. So what is critical is that we put in requirements, you know, musts and codes and requirements and standards for public transport before someone buys this land. Because otherwise, what will happen is your PLC and house builders will compete to spend as much money as possible to buy and win that land, and therefore they don't have much wiggle room. They can't put much in because all the money's gone to the landowner. So if you can get in the requirements that you have proximity to public transport, or that if you buy this land, it is predicated on the fact that you're going to support X percentage of this light rail line, then they will just factor that into their residual land value models, and that is where the money comes from. I think it's a really exciting opportunity actually in the UK for funding this, where, you know, we've got pretty tight budgets, in addition to the fact you can invest in this as well. So yeah, I think focusing on the land, and we need to work out a way in the UK of locking that in before people buy land, essentially, otherwise the opportunity is lost.
So, Catherine, could I come in with something kind of, I think what David said, and I mean, all the speakers stated really links to the land value uplift. And I think one difference is that I think in other European countries, the land value uplift kicks in at the time of the site allocation. While I think in the way we kind of do planning in England, it's often a land value uplift is considered at the kind of planning permission, outline planning permission stage, which often at that point, it is already a developer taking it forward. So in a way, our site allocations, I think, are considered too uncertain. You know, infrastructure providers don't really want to commit funding at that point either. They require a kind of permission, let it be outline or detail. And at that point, it's often too late because transport planning takes a long time. And that's when things are out of kilter as well. So I think we somehow need to adjust the weight we give to site allocation versus the kind of later stage of the permission. And I think one other comment, and I saw somebody mentioned some examples we have in this country where infrastructure, public transport came first, such as North Stowe, a site I'm very familiar with. But I think it's almost that, although that site, for example, has very good public transport links, it's almost like we don't quite believe it because we are still being asked to put the roads in and the car parking and everything else. So I think all developments need to do both at the moment, because while we have a vision, maybe we are too scared that we might not meet it. So we have to have belt and braces, which is a huge cost and space requirement for any development. So maybe we just need to be more confident and believe in our own visions and actually push for them rather than trying to kind of do both.
Thank you. Dominic, is this where a new way of modeling the outcomes can provide the confidence to go for the vision rather than try and cover all bases?
Well, that's a great question, and I think, frankly, the transport modelling community has done itself a bit of a disservice by developing this huge architecture of complex transport models. And now that we've got them, we tend to shift our thinking as modelers into what we can do with the model rather than what questions we really ought to be asking. And I saw a comment in the chat about whether or not the economic models can capture health benefits. Yes, of course they can, if we ask the right questions and if we structure the way we think about our appraisal and our strategic approach to around the questions of what we want to do and what we expect these outcomes to be, rather than models which are fundamentally driven and dominated by roads, which will, as I think David said it very well, that kind of predict and provide approach just isn't very good at capturing the dynamism and the energy that comes from planning a different way. And so we need to improve the dialogue that we have between the modelling community and some of these other great ideas that we're having. But on the funding side, I have to say, just go back to first principles. Who benefits and how much? And the modelling can tell us something about that. And I think David's spot on. Where you've got land in, we've got a mismatch between demand and supply of land. There's a lot of value in land. So let's target that. But in other cases, it might be the beneficiaries might be elsewhere. And I think particularly with public transport and transport in general, we need to remember those benefits are quite diffuse. And actually, general taxation is probably a pretty good way of capturing that across the country.
Thank you. I mean, funding is a big question, a big theme in the questions. One of the questions is said, that the local authorities in this country have no funding to lead on public transport. And David, you mentioned earlier, that should be part of the conditions for development. But how can we turn around that the process in the UK where it does seem that public transport seems to be almost an afterthought in development planning and the process to actually building new developments, rather than the most important thing, which appears to be central to a lot of the Europe successes?
Oh, I can say something.
Oh, Jenny.
So, I mean, you know, people will know that I'm always, I'm very concerned about the way we use a very simple algorithm to generate the housing targets for local authority areas. I mean, different governments have different algorithms, but they're all incredibly simple and they don't really take into account geography, and certainly they don't take into account availability of public transport or the ability really to supply good, frequent public transport. So, I mean, just, you know, I do think that we need a national agreement. We are going to build and grow places where public transport is possible. And the current housing targets, I mean, we're amazed. I don't know, we've tried to calculate, but it may be more than half, or quite a lot more than half, of these housing targets are in areas where to build around public transport would be jolly difficult because there isn't much and they are in the wrong place. And it does need some recognition, I think, this problem, that we are directing, you know, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of new homes to places where road building will be needed to open up the land. So in a way, we're going wrong from the beginning. That's my point.
Katja, can I bring you in there? As you know, part of your thinking on kind of urban planning. Is this something that is being considered, the geography aspect to where new homes are being considered?
I think certainly not enough. And I mean, I think, you know, there are various bodies. I think just this morning I saw a kind of news from the RTPI asking that we need to go back to regional planning. And, you know, Urban Design Group, I think pretty much everybody I can think of is asking for more strategic planning again in the country. And I think it is right, as soon as we kind of identify a location of development, the decisions are made and it's too late at that point. And I think it's almost, there's something in the local plan process that doesn't allow enough flexibility, because if you want to identify an area for development, I mean, new government is talking about lots of new towns. That takes time. But to identify them through the local plan process, you need certainty of delivery. How do you do that? How do you prove certainty of delivery if the development takes 20 plus years? And because at the early stages, you can't be certain that your light rail will be delivered because you haven't got the tick from the government that your funding is in place. So you're not allowed to plan around it and rely on it. So we somehow ended up in a situation where we need to make everything certain and decisions certain way too early. And again, maybe it's a confidence thing that we can't deal with that uncertainty through our processes. And I think it comes back to being able to define a vision, plan for that vision and deliver that vision, rather than being sidetracked very early on by uncertainty of delivery over a very important strategic public transport link.
Because I can see you nodding away there. Do you want to come in here and give us the view from Europe?
Well, yeah, just to make sure that nobody's getting a wrong impression, planning is hard everywhere. And I can, if I talk to colleagues from Sweden, they say, oh, it takes so long. And if I had some students over from Los Angeles and they said, oh, it's going so fast here in Stuttgart, in LA, everything takes time. Nope, it takes time everywhere. Whenever you're in a democracy, you've got public participation, you've got endangered species, you've got people who want to sue you. So we're on in the same boat. So, but this is exactly, also our problem, like what just Katja just said. Like, at what stage do you have what, like, certainty, and can you rely on that, and things like that. So this is just planning, and that's why that that is why it's an academic study, because it's so complicated, and all, like, transport and landscape, etc. So I just want to encourage everybody. Those are just our everyday tasks we have to deal with, and of course we can always look at the processes, and that's what we're doing as well, and like discuss what can be made better, and we should do that. But it's not like planning is easy anywhere in the world.
I was just going to add a very quick point, if I may. One place it is easier in Germany is light rail and tram. And I've just popped a report we did recently. One of the answers will be around devolution. So I think people looked at, there was obviously the DLR was mentioned. Well, the eligibility of what was TfL before to do that in Docklands. Most places can't do that in the UK. Midlands Metro was cited as a good example, but that's one of the most expensive. The outcome is better than nothing, but it was one of the most expensive per kilometre bits of light rail in the world. It was over 100 million, I think, extension. Whereas Spain can get to around about 27 million per kilometre, and Germany's a bit less. And it is because, if you want to build 1 kilometre of light rail in the UK, you have to ask for a Transport and Works Act order. And you have to go to the DfT and say, can I do this? So you have no ability to sort of do that yourself. That can delay by years, takes you out of political cycles, and frankly costs a hell of a lot. And the other one is the utilities. I think in Germany, utility companies foot about 30 or 40% of the bill. In France, it's 100. In Germany, it's about 30, 40% of the bill, which disincentivizes them to replace everything with brand new utilities and dig everything up. So therefore, usually they just lay the trap, and it's like, look, if you need to replace that in 5 years' time, just pause it, pause the service, do it overnight, and build it. Whereas we dig up every single utility and have a really, really risk-averse approach to it, which is why we lump so many costs on. So there are some things that we do need to, some tweaks that we do need to do in the UK to make it easier to build really good mass transit.
Cameron, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I was just going to come in a bit on this point about the role for local government in planning, and I think we've been experimenting with devolution in various ways in the UK now over 15 years or so. And some places have really grasped that. I'm thinking of Greater Manchester, for example, seized that opportunity and built out quite a lot of local public transport, particularly the Metrolink network. And I think it's just worth reflecting on how they were able to do that and what worked. And I think the first thing that I would say is it needed a really good relationship between local and central government. It was quite non-partisan at the time. You had a lot of Conservative governments working with Labour local councillors, but they managed to get together and decide between them that a long-term plan with a long-term funding settlement, a 10-year funding line, a Metrolink delivery partner that wasn't there for one upgrade but was there to learn the lessons and then help them with the future. I think one of the challenges we've got here is certainly short-term budgets, and I know that's a big conversation going into the budget which is coming up, so we'll have to see how that falls. But I think that confidence in the long term, which is partly around relationships and governance, partly around funding arrangements, is really critical.
Thank you. Coming back to where we started on this question, does geography make a big difference? I mean, we're a very, very small, quite lumpy island. Is it easier for less dense countries with perhaps not quite so many little hills in the way to build really good public transport links, light rail or heavy rail, but much more difficult in this country?
Shall I say
Yeah,
something? I mean, I don't really know what the barriers are. Well, I have an idea, but I'll just tell you that so in West Wiltshire, North Wiltshire, Mendip and Bath and North East Somerset, okay, so that's an area which has had so much greenfield development, and it's still going on, not so much Bath, but in the area around it. And now the population is in the region, I think, of 370,000. It's an awful lot of people. Now, Amy, with the railway company, has shown interest in more or less exploiting this and the future growth in order, and we've been working with them and also with Create Streets as well on this concept of a metro for the whole area, to link with the existing Bristol Metro and so on. And there's surprisingly low costs in terms of infrastructure to get something really good going in the way of a modern metro system. But, you know, there is a feeling that the specification, engineering specification is one thing, but then there are so many, you know, really mountainous landscapes of different barriers and no, possibly not. So it's, you know, it would be nice to understand, and I can't be the person who does it, what these barriers are and how to lower them. That would be something so useful. Because at the moment, people sort of almost laugh, you know, and say, oh, a metro, what? But there is actually a rail company interested, so it obviously isn't totally stupid. And Connected Cities, who are an organisation very keen on metros, I mean, they are, you know, putting so much work into this concept, and you can't help thinking, why haven't the Department for Transport got a local rail unit looking at the opportunities for metros? I don't think they have, but there's a suggestion for the future.
Thank you, Jenny. Some of the other questions that have come into the chat focus on the difference between the European examples that's been shared with us today and some of the UK attitudes to housing, in terms of the fact that the success of the European examples are based on kind of high medium density housing, so apartments with amenities on the ground floor, rather than the more traditional housing estates which are still being built in the UK with, you know, rows of houses with drives and with gardens, which make it much more difficult to get people close enough to those amenities. David, for the example you gave in Chippenham, do you just want to do you have any insight into the attitudes of the local people to the development, which did seem to be, on the face of it, much more European?
I'd argue it's much more Chippenham, actually. We essentially did analysis of the town centre of Chippenham, historic bits of Chippenham, people of Chippenham, the locals loved, and we kind of replicated a lot of that. So I think it was actually mostly terraced housing and mansion blocks, you know, very kind of English typologies. And the densities they were probably lower than some of the ones around Stuttgart and the other German examples. And sometimes that won't be right. But this kind of, I guess the phrase we use, gentle density, which is creating towns, right, as opposed to just house builders. And that's kind of how I'm thinking about this, is we are house builders, but we need to get to town building. And that means that you have the density and the life to mix uses, and you also can support public transport, and public transport can support your town. In terms of sort of the approach, I mean, actually Jenny was with me when we went and met a bunch of people, thought we were going to, you know, get some pitchforks out and get back on the train. But actually, the principles were really, really supported. Actually, one of the most kind of supported workshops we've done. There's always going to be questions on maybe not here, maybe somewhere else. And that's just, you know, you've slightly got to accept that, and somewhere you will need to build. But the principles are really, really encouraged and supported. I think it's difficult in the UK, and again, this is where I know planning is difficult everywhere, but it is really difficult here, in that you don't have a very good market of SME developers and a broad market that can do different things. You know, the market that we do have are very, very good at 2 up, 2 downs, 2 cars in the driveway, and, you know, fair play. They've got really good vertical supply chain, and they can deliver that. And they're profitable, etc. We, with our planning system, make it very, very hard for SME developers to come into the market because the planning risk is just so great that if you and your 8 mates set up a developer and you don't get planning on your one site, you probably go bust. Whereas in a sort of more predictable base, so in the German system, you know the viability, you know what you can build, you can plug into one of these big sites where someone's built your tram line, someone's built some of your infrastructure, you know how much you're buying the land for, and you know pretty much how much you can do viability in about probably 3 hours. We were looking at chatting with French architects the other month, and they don't really, viability industry is just so different over there because they know what they can get permission for. And I think until we can kind of build that out, we are going to struggle with asking some of the big PLC house builders to move from their model, which is working for them really well, and we've got to respect.
Yes. Dominic, is there any way that the work that you do can support that approach to showing the viability of slightly more dense development in terms of what it brings in benefits, rather than perhaps a more traditional view that we have in the UK of, if it's high density, it's going to be horrible to live in? Oh, you're on mute, Dominic.
Sorry. No, I think that's just a misconception to start with. The way that I would tend to think about this as an economist is, how do we get as close as we can to what it is that people, what's going to make people's quality of life improve? And if we're asking the right questions in our economic models, that will capture the interactions they have with other people and the quality of their environment and their ability to walk and all of those things, and capitalize it into a house price. And if we think that's valuable, we ought to be able to capture that. I think that there's certainly a challenge, which is almost a cultural challenge in the UK, of the sorts of housing we expect, particularly as with a sort of a view to affluence and becoming middle class and having a garden and a car in the drive. And I think that is something which is is culturally ingrained, and all these things do change. Kind of things can change absolutely radically. Go back to Nairobi, but that's a cultural change as well that I think we need to expect to take some time for people to sink in.
Oh, I know we're running out of time. Kat, did you want one last thought about that, the whole kind of density question?
I mean, I think I totally agree. I think we can't ignore the cultural differences between England, Germany, Netherlands. I mean, it's kind of, I think in those countries, living is much more accepted than it is here. The approach to walking, cycling is very different from when you're born almost. And the right of way for bicycles and all those elements. I think what really struck me is actually kind of something that Thorsten said, that they wouldn't get planning consent if it wouldn't have public transport and it wouldn't be sustainable. So I think it almost kind of says we have the Equalities Act, the Environmental kind of Carbon Reduction Act, etc., etc. So maybe we need to start judging the applications on that and go from there, because that is a very different picture politically and culturally.
Yes, I think that's, and a lot of the comments we've had come in point to a change in the whole way that we approach development in the UK from the government down. So we're not going to change it overnight, but there was some really interesting presentations and discussions. So thank you all for your contributions today. Thank you all for the participants who've joined us online. And we hope to see you at the next webinar, which is on the 28th of November, which covers the topic of what's next in funding for public transport. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.
Bye.
Thank you.